The water had been wrong for 2 days before Wendell Cosby understood that the wrongness was not the water. He sat in the cab of the county truck at 3 minutes past 4 in the morning, engine off, the heater ticking as it cooled. And he watched the gauge readout on the clipboard the way he had watched 1,000 readouts before. 11 feet 4 inches at the Talladega crossing. The creek had no business being at 11 feet 4 inches in the back end of a dry October. There had been no rain to speak of. The upstream gauges said the same flat numbers they had been saying all month, and yet the water under the collapsed span kept rising slow and steady, an inch every few hours, as if something downstream had stoppered the channel and the creek was backing up against it. He had worked culverts and low-water crossings for the road department for 19 years. He knew how water behaved when a beaver dam went up or a slide came down or a hog carcass wedged in a grate. This did not behave like any of those. He wrote the number down. He always wrote the number down. A man who guessed at numbers ended up rebuilding the same washout twice, and Wendell did not like doing things twice. The bridge at Talladega had gone down in the spring, not from flood but from age. The center pier letting go one quiet afternoon and dropping the 2 middle spans into the creek where they still lay half-submerged, sheets of cracked deck angled into the current like the pages of a dropped book. The county had barricaded both approaches with orange water barrels and a steel gate and a sign, and then the county had run out of money, and the bridge had sat that way for 7 months waiting on a grant that kept not coming. Wendell drove out to it twice a week to check the barricade and read the staff gauge and make sure no fool had moved the barrels to take a shortcut that would drown him. It was the loneliest stop on his route, and it had always been the easiest. Nothing happened at the collapsed bridge. That was the point of it. He was a wide, unhurried man, 51 years old, with a gray stubbled jaw he shaved twice a week whether it needed it or not, and a left knee that told him about weather a day before the weather arrived. He had a wife named Ramona, who taught the 4-year-olds at the Baptist church daycare, and a daughter, Selma, grown and gone to Macon, and a grandson named Toby who was 9 months old, and who had been staying out at the house for 3 weeks while Selma worked out a thing with her husband that nobody discussed at the dinner table. Wendell did not exaggerate. He did not tell stories. When men at the shop got going about lights in the sky over the river or panthers, that the state swore had been gone from Georgia for 60 years, he drank his coffee and let them go, and offered nothing because he had learned young that a man's word, and he meant to keep his worth high. So when he tells what happened at the collapsed bridge, he tells it the way he wrote the gauge numbers. Flat. In order. Without reaching for a word bigger than the thing it named. The first wrong thing was the water, and the second wrong thing was the quiet. He noticed the quiet on the second morning. The same morning, the gauge read 11 feet 4. He had stepped out of the cab to walk down the embankment to the staff gauge with his headlamp, and halfway down the slope he had stopped, one boot braced against a root, because the creek bottom at 4 in the morning in October should have been loud. Frogs. The high saw of insects in the privet. The chuck and rustle of something small moving in the leaf litter. He had stood at this crossing in the dark 100 times, and it had never once been silent. The water moved without sound, or with only the sound of itself, and underneath that, there was nothing at all. A held nothing. The kind of quiet that is not peace, but attention. He stood there longer than he meant to. Then he went down and read the gauge and wrote the number and got back in the truck a little faster than was his habit. And he did not examine why. That was Tuesday. He told Ramona about the water at supper because the water was a work problem, and work problems were allowed at the table. He did not tell her about the quiet, because the quiet was not a problem. He could put a number on, and a thing he could not put a number on was not yet a thing. Wednesday he did not drive out to the bridge. His route took in the other side of the county, patching the shoulder on the ridge road where a log truck had torn it up coming down loaded too fast off the grade. He worked the day with a younger man named Dewey Pruitt, a kid of 26 who talked the whole shift about a four-wheeler he was fixing to buy. And Wendell let him talk because the talk filled the cab, and the talk was about a thing with a price on it and a part number, and a thing with a part number was a clean kind of problem, the kind Wendell liked. They shoveled cold patch into the torn shoulder and tamped it, and Dewey ran the plate compactor, and the day smelled of tar and diesel and the dry red dust that came up off the ridge in October. And none of it smelled of musk or wet hair or din, and Wendell was grateful for that without saying so. He thought about the bridge once or twice during the day. The way you think about a faucet you are not sure you turned off. Each time he told himself the water had crested and gone down, and that the barrels were where he had left them. Each time some flat, quiet part of him did not believe it. So, around 2 in the afternoon, Dewey asked him what was eating him, said he'd been quiet even for him, and Wendell said his knee was talking about rain, which was a thing Dewey would accept, and Dewey accepted it and went back to the four-wheeler. The knee was not talking about anything. The knee was fine. It was the first time Wendell could remember using his own body as a lie to get out from under a question. And he noticed himself do it, and he did not like the noticing. Thursday morning he went back. The gauge read 12 feet, even an inch and a half higher than Tuesday, and there had still been no rain. He stood at the top of the embankment with his coffee going cold in the dented thermos and his headlamp on the staff gauge, and he ran the explanations the way he always ran explanations, one at a time like trying keys on a ring. A slide downstream, backing the water. A carcass in the channel. A blockage at the next culvert down. Each key went into the lock, and each key failed to turn, because he knew this creek, knew every bend of it for 3 miles, and there was no slide ground downstream, and the next culvert was a 4-foot box that did not block, and a carcass big enough to back a creek 1.5 feet would have to be the size of a cow, and he would have smelled it by now. He had smelled nothing. He had walked this channel in summer when it ran low enough to wade. He knew where the bedrock came up under the south bank, and where the clay held, and where the old fence wire, from somebody's drowned pasture, still snagged trash in a high water. There was nowhere in 3 miles for a creek to back up against on its own. Water did not pool without something to pool against, and he had built and cleared enough low water crossings to know that the something was always findable, a slide, a jam, a beaver, a wedged log, a collapsed bank. He had been out here 4 days and found nothing that would hold water, and a thing that holds back a creek and cannot be found is not a thing that follows the rules he had spent 19 years learning to trust. Or rather, he had smelled something, but not rot. He noticed it as he was writing the number. A smell coming up off the water carried on the cold air that slid down the channel toward him. It was not the green mud smell of a low creek. It was musk and wet hair and something under that, something sharp and ammoniac, the smell of a den of a thing that had been living close by in a small space for a long time. It was the smell of an animal he could not name and had never smelled. And the part of his brain that had kept him alive on 19 years of night roads sat up and went cold and quiet, the way it did a half-second before a deer came through the headlights. He capped the thermos. He climbed back up to the truck. He told himself it was a bear, because a bear was a thing with a name, and a thing with a name could be reasoned with. The state said there were black bears working back into the river country. A bear denning in the wreck spans would explain the smell and would explain the quiet. Because the small things go silent when a big thing moves in. It did not explain the water. But he set the water aside the way you set aside the one fact that breaks the theory you need to believe. He drove home and he slept badly, and he dreamed of nothing he could remember, only woke at 2 in the afternoon with the hell-breath feeling of a man who has been listening in his sleep. Friday, he brought the camera. It was a trail camera he had bought for deer season and never gotten around to hanging. A cheap thing in a green plastic housing that strapped to a tree and took a picture whenever something warm crossed in front of it. He told Ramona he wanted to see what was getting into the wrecked bridge, a bear most likely, and that the county would want to know before they sent men down to start the demolition in the spring. That was all true. It was also not the whole reason, and he knew it was not, and he strapped the camera to a sweet gum at the top of the embankment, angled down at the near span, and he checked it twice to be sure it sat level, because a thing worth doing was worth doing level. He drove out Saturday before dawn to pull the card. The gauge read 12 feet 7. The smell was stronger, close, and the quiet was total, and he found that he did not want to go down the embankment to the gauge at all, that his body had made a decision his mind had not signed off on. And he stood at the truck door with the card reader in his hand and made himself go down anyway, because a man who let the dark tell him where he could and could not walk on his own route was a man who had already started to lose, and Wendell did not intend to lose. He read the gauge. He climbed back up. He sat in the cab with the doors locked, which he had never once done at this stop, and he put the card in the reader, and he scrolled. 211 pictures. The first 100 were nothing. The camera triggering on a branch moving in the wind, on a possum, on the slow warming of the deck plates at sunrise. He scrolled fast. Then at picture 138 the timestamp said 3:47 in the morning, and the frame was full of something that was not a possum and was not a branch, and he stopped scrolling. It was close to the camera. The flash had whited out the near edge of it so that he could not see the whole, only a piece, a shoulder, and the top of a foreleg and the side of a head turned partly away, and the scale was wrong, the shoulder filling a third of the frame, and the camera was 4 feet off the ground. Whatever it was, the shoulder he was looking at was higher than the camera. He sat with the cold reader in his hand and looked at the picture and did not let himself reach for a word, because the only words available were words he did not use, and he made himself look instead at what was actually in the frame, the way he would look at a washout he had to measure, before he could fix. Dark hair, long and matted, wet at the tips, a foreleg that was too long for its thickness, and that bent in a way a dog's foreleg did not quite bend, an ear, or the base of one, set high on the skull and turned back, in the eye. The flash had caught the eye and thrown it back, amber gold and flat, a steady shine with no panic in it, no startle. The eye of a thing that had heard the camera click and had turned to look at it the way a man turns to look at a sound he has already decided is not a threat. Not startled. Measuring. He scrolled to the next frame, empty. The thing had simply not been there. One click later, the span lit, gray-green by the flash, and the deck plates angled into the black water. And nothing on them. He scrolled forward and back, and there were only the 2 frames, the full one and the empty one, 11 seconds apart by the timestamp. And in 11 seconds a thing the size of the thing in that frame had crossed out of the picture without disturbing the wrecked deck or the still water, or making, he was now certain. He took the card out of the reader and he put it in the chest pocket of his shirt, and he buttoned the pocket. Then he drove home, and at the 4-way by the feed store he sat through the stop sign a beat too long, and a man in a dually behind him tapped the horn, and Wendell raised a hand in apology and did not feel his own hand do it. He did not show Ramona the picture. He told himself it was because she would worry, and that was part of it. But the larger part was that he had not finished deciding what the picture was, and Ramona would look at it and say a word. She would not be able to help it. She would reach for the nearest word the way everybody reached for the nearest word. And once the word was in the kitchen, it would be in the house. And Toby was in the house. So he kept the card in his pocket, and he went out to the shed. And he stood at the workbench under the one bare bulb. And he looked at the picture again on the little reader screen. And the second time was worse than the first, because the first time he had been looking for what it was, and the eye was looking back with that flat amber patience that did not belong to any animal that ran or any animal that hid. He thought about the water then. 12 feet 7 and climbing, no rain, no slide, no carcass. A thing living in the wrecked spans, big, quiet, patient. And he understood, standing at the bench, that he had been thinking about the water as a puzzle, and that it had never been a puzzle. Something was in that channel, and the water was rising, because the something was there, packing the wreck of the bridge, with whatever it dragged in, building the den up out of the current. And the creek was backing against the den the way a creek backs against any dam. The water was not the mystery. The water was the evidence. He had been reading the evidence for 4 days and calling it weather. Sunday Ramona took Toby to her sister's after church, and Wendell drove back out alone in the daylight because he wanted to see the wreck in the daylight, wanted the sun to take the thing in the picture and shrink it down to a bear or a stray, or a trick of the flash. The county had a rule he was breaking, and he knew it. No crew member at a collapsed structure without a second man. But he was not a crew this afternoon. He was a man answering a question, and a man can go alone to answer a question if he is careful, and Wendell was always careful. The daylight proved nothing at all. He stood at the top of the embankment in the thin October sun, and the creek lay below him, brown and high and silent, 12 feet some inches of it where there should have been 4, the wrecked spans rising out of it, black and wet, and the smell came up off the water in the warm middle of the day, same as it had in the dark. Musk and den, and that ammoniac sharpness. Under it he walked the barricade. The barrels were where he had left them. The gate was chained. And down at the base of the near embankment, in the soft mud at the water line where he had not gone in the dark, he found the tracks. He crouched over them with his elbows on his knees the way he crouched over everything he meant to measure. They were pressed deep in the mud, deep the way a thing presses that carries real weight, and they were long, longer than his own boot, and they were not a bear's. A bear leaves a track like a wide, bare, human foot with claw points ahead of the toes. These were not that. These had 4 long toes and a heel that came down narrow, and the toes ended in claw marks that drove a full inch ahead of the pad and the stride between them. When he stood and walked it off heel to heel was longer than his own walking stride, and his was not a short man's stride. He took out the carpenter pencil he kept in his shirt pocket, behind the camera card, and he laid it across the clearest print for scale. And he took a picture with his phone, and his hands were steady. How the screen took a thing that had stood here in the mud and turned it into something a man could thumb past. He measured the stride at 51 inches. He measured the print at 11.5. He wrote the numbers on the back of his hand with the carpenter pencil, because he had not brought the clipboard, and he climbed back up to the truck. And he sat, and he called the county dispatch. And that was the first of the calls that went nowhere. The woman at dispatch was named Pauline, and Wendell had known her for 15 years, and she was not a fool. And that was almost worse, because a fool he could have dismissed. He told her there was a large animal denning in the collapsed bridge at Talladega, and that he had tracks and a trail camera image, and that before the county sent any crew down there in the spring, Somebody ought to know. Pauline asked him what kind of animal. He said he did not know. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that is a person deciding how to file you. And then Pauline said in her careful voice that she would log it and pass it to the wildlife office. And that bears were moving back into the river country this year, had he considered it might be a bear. And he had ruled it out, and Pauline logged it and passed it along, and nothing came of it. Because a man who calls in a large animal he cannot name has, in the eyes of every system built to respond, named himself instead. He sat in the cab after she hung up and looked at the numbers on the back of his hand. 51 and 11.5, already starting to smudge where his glove had rubbed them, and he thought about how he had sounded on the phone. Careful. Flat. A man reporting a measurement. He had given Pauline nothing she could write down as alarm because alarm was not a thing he carried. And he understood now that the very steadiness that made his word worth keeping was the thing that would keep anyone from coming. That if he had screamed into the phone, they might have sent a deputy out of caution. They would send no one. And that the price of a lifetime of not exaggerating was that the one time it was true, he would be believed exactly as much as he always was, which was to say, filed and forgotten. He wiped the numbers off the back of his hand with his thumb before they could fade on their own. He had them written down where they belonged. The wildlife office called him back Monday. A young officer, polite, who said the photo Wendell had emailed was too close and too blown out by the flash to identify. Which was true, and that the track in the mud was consistent with a large dog or a black bear with an unusual gait, which was not true, and that he would try to get out to the site within the next 2 weeks as his schedule allowed. 2 weeks? Wendell thanked him and hung up and sat in the truck in the shopyard and understood that he was alone with this, that the help he had been raised to call would not come. Not because anyone was cruel, but because the thing he was describing did not fit in any box on any form. He went home and he checked the latches on the windows, all of them, which he had never done in 20 years in that house. He started in the kitchen and worked the rooms in order, the way he worked a barricade, thumbing each latch to be sure it had thrown. And in Toby's room he stood a while at the window, over the crib, with the fox-printed sleep sack folded on the rail, and he checked that latch twice. Ramona watched him do it from the kitchen doorway with Toby on her hip, and she did not say anything. But he saw her see it, saw her file it the way Pauline had filed his call. He came back through and washed up, and they sat down to supper. A pork chop and rice and the field peas she put up every August, and the kitchen was warm and the radio was low, and Toby banged a plastic spoon on the tray of the high chair. And Wendell ate and said little, and felt the warmth of it the way a man feels the warmth of a fire he is about to have to leave. Then Ramona put her fork down, and she asked him straight what was going on out at that bridge. And he gave her the water, the gauge numbers, the smell, the quiet. He gave her the tracks and the measurements, 51 inches and 11.5, the carpenter pencil laid across the print. He did not give her the picture. And Ramona, who was not hysterical and was not dismissive, and who had been married to a man who did not exaggerate for 28 years, listened to all of it with her hands flat on the table, and then she asked the only question that mattered. He said he didn't think so. The bridge was 9 miles out. There was no reason for it to come this way. It was the first thing he had told her in 28 years that they both heard land as a lie, not because he meant it as one. Because neither of them believed it, and they both heard the other one not believe it, and the not believing sat down at the table between them like a third person and did not leave. Tuesday, the gauge read 12 feet 9, and Wendell did not go to the bridge, because he had stopped going to the bridge, and he hated himself for it in a flat, quiet way, and went anyway to the ridge road and patched shoulder and told himself the camera would tell him what he needed to know. He had left the camera hanging. He pulled the card remotely on the cheap app that came with it, the one that worked when the signal held, and the signal held that afternoon long enough to pull the last 2 days. And there were 9 pictures, all of them between 3 and 4 in the morning, all of them the same rec span, and in none of them was there anything at all. Empty span. Empty span. Empty span. He scrolled them at the workbench and felt the relief start to come up, and then he looked again, and the relief stopped, because the camera in every frame was angled wrong. It was pointed too far to the left. He had hung it level and square on the near span, and now it sat canted 10 degrees off, looking at the embankment instead of the deck, and a camera does not turn itself on a strap. Something had turned it. Something had stood at the sweet gum where the camera hung 4 feet and more off the ground, and had moved the housing on its strap so that it no longer watched the span, and had done it without tripping a single usable frame of itself. The way a man reaches around a corner for a light switch in a room he already knows. It knew what the camera was, it knew what the camera saw, and it had moved the camera so the camera would stop seeing. He sat with that a long time under the bare bulb. He thought about the strap, the way he had cinched it 2 passes around the trunk, and the buckle drawn down hard, because a thing worth hanging was worth hanging tight. A wind did not move that. A branch did not move that. A bear that wanted the camera off the tree would have torn it down, dragged it, mouthed it, left it cracked in the leaves the way bears left everything they were curious about, broken. This had not been torn down. It had been turned. Adjusted. The angle changed by a careful 10 degrees, and the camera left hanging right where he had put it, working, taking its pictures of the embankment now, instead of the span, and the only reason to turn a camera instead of breaking it was to leave the man who owned it looking at the wrong place and believing he was looking at the right one. It had not wanted the camera gone. It had wanted the camera lying, and it had understood well enough to act on it, the difference between the two. The next morning the smell was at the house. He came out before dawn to start the truck and warm it, and the cold air off the pasture carried it to him across the yard, musk and wet hair and that ammoniac sharpness. Under it faint, but they are unmistakable, the smell of the bridge, 9 miles out, standing here in his own yard between the truck and the back porch. He stood on the steps and did not move, and made his eyes go slow across the dark of the yard the way he would glass a tree line for a buck. Slow, no jump, giving nothing away. And the yard gave him nothing back, only the shapes he knew, the truck, and the propane tank and the fence line. The smell was there all the same. And the small sounds of the morning, the one rooster 2 farms over, the early traffic out on the county road, all of it was gone. The same held. Nothing he had stood inside on the embankment, the quiet that was not peace, but attention. He went back inside, and he did not start the truck. He called the shop and told them he was taking a personal day, which he had not done in 4 years. And Dewey answered and said, "Sure thing," and asked, was it the knee? And Wendell said it was the knee, the lie easy now the second time he had spent his own body to buy his way out of a question. He hung up and he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his deer rifle across his knees, cleaned and loaded, not because he believed the rifle would matter against the thing in the trail camera frame, but because a man holds the tool he has, and he watched the gray come up slow over the pasture and prove nothing at all. He thought, sitting there, about how far the smell had come. 9 miles by the creek, more by the road. A bear had a range, but a bear did not pick a house out of a county and carry its own smell to the man who had photographed it. The smell in the yard was not an accident of wind. The smell in the yard was the same as the camera turned 10 degrees, a thing done on purpose to be found, a message left in the one language Wendell had proven he would read, which was the language of physical sign. It had learned that he measured things. It had learned that he believed his nose and his eyes and his tape over anything anybody told him. And it had brought him across 9 miles of dark river country, the one piece of evidence he could not measure his way out of, which was its own presence standing in his yard between the truck and the porch, in the hour before the baby woke. He had Ramona take Toby to her sister's that day and stay there. He did not dress it up. He told her the smell had been in the yard, and that until he understood it, he wanted the baby somewhere else.